ever get that feeling? Like you stumble upon a historical question, and it seems so simple at first, but the more you dig, the deeper the rabbit hole goes.
Yeah, like it pulls you in, and suddenly you're grappling with all these complex layers you never even considered.
Exactly. And that's exactly the adventure we're on today. We're taking a deep dive into a question that, on the surface, seems pretty straightforward. When exactly was the crucifixion of Jesus Christ?
It's a date that many people assume is, well, a known fact, right? Like set in stone.
Yeah, you'd think so. But the source material you've gathered paints a much more intriguing picture and honestly a lot more complicated.
Definitely. What we're dealing with here is a truly interdisciplinary investigation. We've got archaeology, astronomy, you've got ancient texts, even geology, all converging to suggest a timeline that honestly might surprise some folks.
It surprised me, I'll tell you that. And the crux of what we've uncovered points towards a pretty substantial shift from the traditional understanding. We're talking about the crucifixion potentially occurring on Monday, April 14th, in the year 32 AD. Monday. I know, right? I think for a lot of us, the immediate reaction is, wait a minute, isn't it always Good Friday? And that, my friend, is the mystery we're here to unravel today.
That's the deep dive.
Exactly. So our mission today is to unpack all this evidence bit by bit so that you can understand the reasoning behind this alternative dating and maybe, just maybe, come away with a new perspective on a story that's been told and retold for centuries. Where do we even begin with something like this?
Well, let's start someplace tangible, someplace you can almost picture. Imagine the ruins of Pompeii. One of our sources highlights a piece of graffiti found there, and it's dated to February 6th, 60 AD.
Oh, wow. Pompeii, I mean, that just conjures up such vivid imagery. So we have this ancient Roman city frozen in time, and someone probably just going about their day scratched this date on a wall, February 6th, 60 AD.
Just another day in Pompeii. But there's a twist. They used the Roman dating system, which was based on counting down the days to the ides of the month. And right alongside that date, they also included the phrase dies solis.
Dies solis, the day of the sun, which, if we're thinking about it in our terms, means Sunday, right?
Right, Sunday. But here's where the problem arises. According to our modern Gregorian calendar, and even the Julian calendar they were using back then, February 6th, 60 AD, fell on a Wednesday.
So we've got a Roman in Pompeii clearly labeling a Wednesday as Sunday.
Yeah, and that right there is a major disconnect. How could that be? Well, that's where understanding how ancient cultures reckon time becomes absolutely crucial. It's a key to unlocking this whole puzzle.
So it's not just about the calendar itself, it's about their whole concept of when the day began and ended, right?
Precisely. For the Babylonians, the early Romans, the Jewish tradition, they all mark the start of a new day at nightfall, not at dawn like we do with our Gregorian system.
Oh, interesting. So their day was from sunset to sunset, and ours is from sunrise to sunrise. That seemingly small difference has huge implications when we try to reconcile their calendar with ours.
Huge implications. And to really grasp why they started their day at nightfall, we have to look at their ancient astrological systems. The Babylonians had this fascinating system of planetary hours.
Planetary hours. Okay, tell me more about that, because that sounds really cool.
It is cool. Every hour of the day was assigned to a specific planet, and they followed a very particular order. And here's the key insight. The entire day was named after the planet that ruled its first hour. And guess when that first hour began?
At nightfall. That makes perfect sense. So you're essentially assigning a ruler to each hour, and the planet that's ruling that very first hour at nightfall, that's the planet that gets to name the whole day. It's like a cosmic roll call.
I like that, a cosmic roll call. And what's so amazing is that this Babylonian system didn't just stay put in Mesopotamia. It traveled. It spread to Greece, where the Greeks substituted their own deities for the Babylonian planet.
Oh, so they kept the system, but they personalized it with their own gods. So instead of, say, Mars, they might have used Eras.
Exactly. And then the Romans adopted it from the Greeks, and that's how we ended up with our 7-day week and the names we still use today. Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Each one linked back to those ancient planetary rulers.
It all goes back to the stars, and this really emphasizes the fact that for all these cultures, the day flipped over, not at the crack of dawn, but as the sun was setting.
Right. The day began when the stars started to become visible.
One of the sources even quotes this guy, Verisis Valens, who straight up says that the first hour of the day began at sunset, which aligned with both the Greek and Babylonian customs. And we see the same idea in the Jewish tradition too, right? I mean, the Sabbath, that starts on Friday evening and ends on Saturday evening.
Absolutely. Josephus, the Jewish historian, he confirms that their day also began at sunset, pointing back to that phrase from Genesis, tarde y mañana, which means evening and morning.
Evening and morning. It's right there in the creation story, that cycle of evening and morning defining a day. So we've established that these ancient cultures were operating on a nightfall to nightfall system. Now let's circle back to that Pompeii graffiti. How does this different way of starting the day explain that apparent Sunday-Wednesday mismatch?
All right, so let's break it down. Picture a Roman dies solis, their Sunday. It started at nightfall on what we would consider Saturday.
Okay, so their Sunday actually began on our Saturday night. Got it.
Right. So that entire 24-hour period, from our Saturday night to our Sunday night, that was their Sunday. Now imagine shifting that whole chunk of time forward, aligning it with our modern Gregorian system, which begins at dawn.
So it's like we're taking their Sunday and sliding it forward about 9 hours. And because it's a 24-hour period, it's going to spill over into our Monday and even into our Tuesday and, well, a little bit into our Wednesday, right?
Precisely. The sources even give us a formula to visualize this. Gregorian day equals the ancient nightfall day plus approximately 9 hours, modulo 7. Modulo 7 just means that it cycles through the 7 days of the week.
So because their day began about 9 hours earlier than ours, what they call dies solis, their Sunday, starting at nightfall, would overlap with our Wednesday. And that's how you get that seemingly contradictory inscription in Pompeii.
The Pompeii graffiti isn't an error. It's a reflection of a completely different framework for understanding time. And grasping this concept is crucial when we apply it to the crucifixion. Because if their day began at nightfall, then what they considered a Friday, the day of Venus, wouldn't line up with our Gregorian Friday.
Oh, I see where you're going with this. So their Friday, starting at nightfall, would actually push forward and land squarely on our Monday.
Exactly. And we find even more support for this shift in day naming when we delve into the writings of Athanasius.
Athanasius, the Bishop of Alexandria, he was a big deal back in the 4th century, right?
A major figure in early Christianity. And his writings give us some really valuable clues about how the way days were named was changing. What do you see in the source material about Athanasius?
His Paschal letters, the ones focused on figuring out the date for Easter, they're really interesting. They show that by the 4th century, there were 2 distinct systems for naming the days running side by side. You had the days of John, which seemed to line up with what would become the Christian tradition and possibly a dawn-based system.
So a newer system, potentially reflecting a shift in how Christians were starting to think about the day.
Right. And then you still had the older system, the days of the planetary gods. And here's the fascinating part. Athanasius explicitly connects his first Sunday, or the day of the sun, with the first Wednesday, which would be the day of Mercury in the planetary system.
That's a significant correlation. It further suggests that the names of the days had shifted in their alignment with our Gregorian calendar because of that change in when the day was considered to begin.
So we've got that archaeological evidence from Pompeii, we've got these textual clues from Athanasius, both pointing to this fundamental shift in timekeeping. But how does all this help us actually pinpoint the date of the crucifixion? I mean, that's the whole point of this deep dive, right?
Okay, let's connect the dots. If the ancient Friday of the crucifixion actually corresponds to a Monday in our Gregorian system, then what we need to do is find a year between 28 AD and 36 AD. That's the generally accepted time frame for when the crucifixion happened, where the Jewish Passover fell on a Monday according to our Gregorian calendar, and Passover always occurs on the 14th of Nisan.
Makes sense. And one of our sources actually lays out a table of Passover dates for that entire period. What does it show?
Well, if you look at the table, it clearly shows that the Passover in the year 32 AD, specifically on April 14th, fell on a Monday.
And April 14th, 32 AD, a Monday. Okay, so that's one major piece of the puzzle falling into place. But the sources don't stop there. They bring in astronomical data, too, which adds a whole other dimension to this investigation.
This is where it gets really exciting. The sources highlight a total lunar eclipse that occurred on April 14th, 32 AD, and importantly, it would have been visible in Jerusalem.
Wow, a lunar eclipse on the very date we're focusing on. So what do the simulations using software like Stellarium show about the timing of this eclipse?
Well, according to the simulations, the eclipse in Jerusalem began around 9:36 in the morning and lasted until about 1:15 in the afternoon. And the period of totality, meaning when the moon was fully within the Earth's shadow, that occurred roughly between 10:36 a.m. and 12:15 p.m.
So right around midday. Now, this wasn't some localized event. I mean, a total lunar eclipse, that's a pretty big deal, astronomically speaking.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
This would have been visible from many parts of the world. The Americas, the Pacific, East Asia, they all would have witnessed this eclipse, although it would have been nighttime in those regions. But for Jerusalem, it was happening in broad daylight. And now think about the gospel accounts. What do they say about darkness during the crucifixion?
Well, the Gospels of Luke, Mark, and Matthew all describe this period of darkness happening while Jesus was on the cross. Luke even specifically says that the sun was darkened, and both Mark and Matthew mention this darkness falling over the entire land, from the 6th hour until the 9th hour.
Which, if we're thinking about it in our terms, that corresponds roughly to noon to 3 in the afternoon.
And that aligns almost perfectly with that period of totality during the lunar eclipse in Jerusalem. That can't be just a coincidence, can it?
It's a pretty striking alignment of events. And the sources also highlight a passage from the book of Acts, where Peter talks about these signs that will appear before the day of the Lord, including the moon turning to blood and the sun being darkened.
A blood moon, that's what they often call a total lunar eclipse, right? Because when the Earth's shadow completely covers the moon, it can take on this reddish, almost coppery hue.
It's a pretty dramatic sight, and it's entirely possible that this is what Peter was referring to.
Okay, so we have this plausible astronomical event, a total lunar eclipse, happening at the exact time the Gospels describe this darkness during the crucifixion. But the sources go even further, incorporating geological findings from that period in Judea.
Geological evidence, yeah. So we're not just looking at the skies now, but we're looking at what was happening on the ground. What did archaeologists find?
Well, at Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, excavations have revealed these distinct layers of destruction that date back to the 1st century AD, specifically to the years between 31 and 33 AD.
So right around the time of the crucifixion.
Exactly. And at Herodium, one of Herod the Great's fortresses, they've found cracks in the walls that also date back to that same period. Geologists who have studied this evidence think it points to a pretty significant earthquake. They're estimating the magnitude was somewhere between 6.5 and 7.0.
Wow, a major earthquake. And how might this earthquake connect to the biblical accounts?
Well, in Matthew's gospel, there's this very specific detail. It says that at the moment Jesus died, the earth shook and the rocks were split. This earthquake could potentially explain that. And remember that passage from Acts we talked about where Peter mentions vapor of smoke along with the darkened sun and blood moon?
Right, I remember.
Well, maybe that vapor of smoke was actually dust and smoke being kicked up into the atmosphere by a massive earthquake. It all starts to fit together.
It does, doesn't it? So you have this total lunar eclipse happening right at the time the Gospels describe darkness. You have geological evidence pointing to a major earthquake in Judea right around that same time. And the sources even mention a couple of accounts from classical historians that seem to corroborate these events.
Yeah, they mentioned Sallust, who was writing around 52 AD, and he talks about this period of darkness during the reign of Tiberius, who was the emperor when Jesus was crucified. He attributed it to an eclipse. Now, he doesn't explicitly tie it to the crucifixion, but it's interesting that he notes this unusual darkness happening during that time.
Another piece of the puzzle.
Right. And then there's Phlegon, a writer from the 2nd century. He reportedly mentions an earthquake in Bithynia, which is in modern-day Turkey, and a period of darkness, both happening around 32 or 33 AD.
So multiple sources, both biblical and non-biblical, pointing to these unusual events happening around the time of the crucifixion. It really makes you think about the potential convergence of events, both local and global.
It's incredible, isn't it? So when we consider all this evidence, the shift in the calendar, the lunar eclipse, the earthquake, these historical accounts, the sources propose a really compelling integrated hypothesis about the darkness described in the Gospels.
It's not just one thing, but potentially a confluence of factors all happening around the same time. What do the sources say about that?
The idea is that the darkness wasn't necessarily just from one single cause, but a combination of events happening simultaneously. You had this local darkness in Jerusalem caused by the earthquake, all that dust and smoke blocking out the sun. And at the same time, you had this total lunar eclipse happening on a global scale, visible as that blood moon that Peter described.
A local phenomenon and a global phenomenon happening at the same time. And the timing of both these events aligns perfectly with the idea that the ancient Friday of the crucifixion actually corresponds to our Gregorian Monday, April 14th, 32 AD.
It's pretty amazing when you think about all these different threads, from archaeology to astronomy to geology, all weaving together to potentially rewrite our understanding of this pivotal historical event.
So to sum it all up, this deep dive suggests that the crucifixion of Jesus Christ likely occurred on Monday, April 14th in the year 32 AD. And that apparent 3-day discrepancy between the traditional Friday and this proposed Monday, that can be explained by that fundamental shift in how people calculated and named the days of the week, moving from a nightfall to nightfall system to our modern dawn-to-dawn reckoning.
It's a great example of how our modern perspective can sometimes cloud our understanding of the past.
Absolutely. And the darkness described in the Gospels, well, that seems to have been a truly remarkable confluence of events. A local darkness caused by an earthquake, coinciding with a total lunar eclipse that was visible across much of the globe.
This whole deep dive really underscores the importance of considering different perspectives, different ways of understanding the world when we're looking at historical events. What seems like a straightforward question like, what was the date, can actually involve all these layers of interpretation and a truly interdisciplinary approach.
It's a reminder that history is complex. There's always more to uncover. And sometimes questioning our assumptions can lead to some really fascinating discoveries.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? If something as fundamental as our understanding of the days of the week has shifted so significantly over time, what other historical narratives that we take for granted might look different if we were to re-examine them through new lenses with new information and a willingness to challenge our preconceived notions? It's definitely something to ponder.
It is. There's always more to learn, more to explore, and that's the beauty of history, isn't it? It's a never-ending journey of discovery.
A journey we get to take together. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.
Bye, man.